Okay. All right. Okay, there we go. Alrighty. So I know who I am. I know what I'm doing. Right. Okay. So today we're gonna keep going over the generations. Right. So we're almost done with Gen X, and then we will be moving on from Gen X to Millennials, and then Gen Z, and finishing off with this unit. Hopefully in the next couple of classes. Okay. So last time we were talking about our Gen X friends. So again, Gen X, this generation born 65 to 1979. So just the generation after the baby boomers. Most of them children of the silence, the younger part of the silent generation, or the very young part of the baby boomers. Okay. So we ended off kind of talking about, I think this slide. And we were talking about a change in values for Gen X. And specifically, very focused on self-help. So carrying through from the baby boomers and their shift from kind of being anti-authority when they were young to as they transitioned into adulthood and started having kids, being much more about finding themselves and being interested in self-discovery, self-growth, and the self-help kind of movement. And then Gen X, right, what we see is a continuation of this, a continuation in that individualism, but very much a shift, and it crosses over before, basically these values kind of cross over before we get to Gen X. But then for Gen X, it is very prominent. They are kind of unabashed materialists in terms of their aspirations. What are they interested in? Not so much, developing a meaningful philosophy of life, though, and, why do they go to college? Not so much for that. Many more of them say they go to college, in order to become financially well off, right? And we talked about that shift from intrinsic values, meaning ideas helping others, to extrinsic values, right? Things that, what do they want? They want money, fame, and images. Or sorry, not images. They're focused on money, fame, and their image. Okay. College students in Gen X, right, much more likely to agree with, the statement that they want to become well off financially rather than developing some kind of philosophy on life. And you see this shift, right? Starting again with the baby boomers, but then moving through into Gen X, it becomes the sort of dominant narrative. Why do you go to college? You go to college to become well off, right? And like I said last time, you see along with this a decline in the humanities and a rise in things like the physical sciences, engineering, as the sort of focuses of what college is for, because it's about that being financially well off. And this certainly continues with millennials and Gen Z, who think that education is of instrumental value. We'll talk about this with the millennials. It is a means to an end, right? Rather than an end in and of itself. Okay, so no questions. All right. So Gen X has a kind of interesting trajectory in terms of their mental health. Essentially, they start kind of in a worse spot than any other generation, and they end up in kind of a reasonably good place. So this graph is a little bit confusing, right? So what do we have? Percent of U.S. adults with depression by age group. So it's a little hard, to isolate Gen X out here. But what we see, right, as they move through the life course, here they are when they're young, right? As we kind of transition through, it rises, and we end up with the millennials, who are having, so 26 to 40, a lot of struggles. The Gen Xers, however, when they're moving into their 40s, 40 to 51, are doing better. So as teenagers, what happened with Gen X? Well, they had worse mental health as teens than the silents or the baby boomers, right? So things were bad. Nearly double the teen suicides compared to with the boomers, but generally better mental health as adults. Okay, sorry, there's a few kind of possible explanations here, and Twenge offers a couple of them. So when we're talking about like what were things like, and Gen X gets let me say one thought at a time. I have 10 thoughts in my head, and I need to make sure that I filter them so only one of them comes out of my mouth at once. So Gen X has a bit of a reputation, right? As a generation that was pretty depressed, a generation that's pretty cynical, right? A generation that doesn't have a lot of social trust. And this all kind of shows up in the next two slides. So what's happening when Gen X is young? Well, in general, there's a bit of a breakdown in terms of social structure. So there's really high crime, right? Crime is really high when Gen X is young, right? Crime is has been spiking for a while, and it sort of hits its peak around kind of the end of the 1980s, like somewhere between 1988 and 1991, right? Is kind of the peak of a sort of crime wave. So as they're in their kind of adolescent years, a lot of Gen Xers are living through a really high crime environment, right? And especially a lot of violent crime. There's drug epidemics going on, right? The crack cocaine epidemic, especially, is ravaging certain communities, especially inner city African Americans. There's all sorts of social problems going on, which Gen X is really, really aware of. The suicide rate is a little hard to explain, but Twenge suggests, and others have suggested as well, that it's related to deregulation. And again, this is American data. Deregulation of guns. So guns are particularly available. Once you get into the 1980s, you get a bit of a crackdown, not through the whole United States, but in certain parts on kind of gun ownership. Gun safety regulations are really stressed. And this, the suicide rate then kind of goes down as the Gen Xers enter, emerging adulthood. So there's lots going on. It's probably, a high crime, low trust environment. And I'll show you on the next slide here. There's a general kind of breakdown in social fabric for Gen X. So what do we have? Sorry, it's really small on my very small tablet. I should have gone with the bigger laptop. Okay, so percent of trust in others, right, amongst US 12th graders. And what do you see, right? So this is our first chart. So do you think that most people would try to take advantage of you if they got a chance, or try to be fair, right? So that's our dotted line. Would you say that most of the time people try to be helpful? That's this line. And obviously there's a question about trust in there. Generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted, right? So that's our dark line. And what you see during Gen X, right, it wasn't especially high for the boomers. It kind of spikes early in our Gen X sample, jumps up, and then crashes way the heck down, right? So social trust for Gen X is relatively low, right? And it's on a decline as they're, moving through, their teen years and into emerging adulthood. Okay, so, and what study is this? I don't know if it says. Oh, this is all monitoring the future. So I will say a couple words about monitoring the future. Monitoring the future is this really cool, longitudinal study that's been going on in the US for decades, right? I think it starts back in 1970. And basically, they've been doing surveys of high school, US 12th graders as they graduate. I think they actually do, 8th, 10th, and 12th graders as they're moving through kind of, what you would call high school, going into high school and coming out of high school in the US. And so it's tracked data for a really long time. So we're going to come back a whole bunch of times through the term to monitoring the future. Because it's a really interesting study, and it gives us a really good idea how things have changed for different generational cohorts as they move through the life course. So for Gen X in this monitoring the future sample, what we see, Gen X starts at a kind of high point of trust, right? They think people can be trusted, they think people are mostly helpful, and they think people are mostly fair. And it drops, from a height of, let's say, around in the 30s down to, really mid-teens by the time you get there. And then the one that stays, helpful stays a little higher, up in the kind of mid-20s, mid-low 20s, rather. So generally low social trust. And obviously, social trust is important. What it suggests when you have social trust breaking down is there's a breakdown in social institutions, right? People feel disconnected and they feel like they can't trust other people in their society. All right, institutional trust kind of looks similar. Again, this is data from monitoring the future. Trust in government, government run for the people versus big interests, and people running the government are honest. And you see, all of these kind of start in a reasonable place for Gen X, and they all decline. Now, most of them stay, I think, relatively high through the sample, except for people running the government are honest. Hang on, I'm going to erase what I drew there so you can see it a little better. People running the government are honest, right? That one starts right around, somewhere in the Gen X sample. You get, give or take, it's closing in on 70%, and it crashes well below majority and into only the high 30s by the end of our Gen X sample. Now, there's a lot of things going on there as well. I mean, you're talking about, you've lived through things like Nixon, the Nixon administration, the Carter administration. So those are both really bad political kind of administrations. Nixon obviously gets caught cheating and stealing, secrets from the opposition party, and is about to get impeached when he resigns. And then you get Carter, where things go really bad during the 1970s. And then Reagan, during the Reagan administration, there's lots of scandals as well. So lots of bad things going on. Reagan's definitely a corporatist, and a lot of people feel like, the government's run essentially for corporations. So that by the time they exit, and what else happens in the 1990s? Obviously, the other one that you get is Clinton, right? And Clinton has a number of sex scandals where he basically sexually coerces and assaults his interns. So you have a lot of problems in government going on at this time, which probably leads to that decline in trust, right? And you have Bill Clinton, what was it? Sort of in front of Senate committees and, being asked whether he had sex with one of his interns, which, I guess technically he didn't, because all they did was have oral sex. And so he's like, well, it really depends on what your definition of is, right? If your definition of is, well, if it is, then I definitely did that. If your definition of isn't, then I didn't. So people kind of lose trust in government through the Clinton years, and it reflects in that, that end of Gen X data where trust in government is pretty low. Okay, income inequality. This is another thing that Twenge suggests. Income inequality starts relatively low in the 1970s, and through the lives of Gen X, it rises pretty steadily, right? So the richest versus the average, the incomes really diverge, and you can see, though it doesn't track exactly, because lack of trust sort of ping-pongs up, not in direct correlation, but they're following kind of similar lines, right? And this, as rising income inequality may play a role in, declining social trust, because if you don't feel like you can get ahead, if you feel like the system is rigged for, certain people, that they're going to get ahead and you're not going to, the rules aren't fair, there's a really strong chance that it's going to skew the way you think about things, right? Okay, does that all make sense? Okay, So millennials, and I will just, this is the best generation. I'm kidding. That's my generation, right? So I'm born in 82. A couple of years after the start of what we call the millennials. Okay, so millennials are, I think you could say, kind of a weird generation in lots of ways. We'll talk about them, and Twenge's written extensively on them in 2 books. So she writes about them in Generations as well, but she also wrote, Generation Me and the narcissism epidemic about millennials. So tell how she feels about millennials. Okay, so what do we have? What do we want to talk about with the millennials? Okay, so this is narcissistic personality inventory scores for U.S. college students. And what do you see, right, with the millennials? And that, again, is our shaded area in gray. Well, you see a rise of about 2 points on the narcissistic personality inventory, right? So narcissistic personality, you definitely see a bit of a spike on it as compared to Gen X when you look at the millennials, right? And this is, in a lot of ways, not surprising given the way that millennials were parented, right? They are relentlessly told to focus on themselves and how special they are and all of that stuff. Okay, so kind of quick points from her book, Generation Me. So millennials are pretty convinced that they are special, right? They have a firm belief in their self-expression, and that the only person that you need to impress is yourself, right? That basically you are the only person that matters. That's pretty deeply, so if you like yourself, well, if nobody else does, that's okay too. Focused on self-gratification, self-esteem, right? And like I said, this is a generation which in large part, is kind of raised on Sesame Street and the sort of idea that you are extra super special. In a lot of ways, this leads to a kind of superiority complex and entitlement. And what will happen when the millennials get into the workplace is they get tagged with both of these by Boomer and Gen X employers, saying that millennials are super entitled, right? They think they deserve everything right here, right now, and that they're better than you at everything, so they don't need to put in the time. And this will end up clashing pretty harshly with sort of Boomer notions that you need to work your way up the corporate ladder before you get to stuff like work-life balance. Not something the Boomers believed in early in their career. Okay. They're also pretty optimistic, right? They have a firm belief that dreams can become reality and that you can have it all, right? Fun, fame, fortune, and fulfillment. That you can kind of have all of your dreams, especially when they're young. Now, with that, though, this is a generation of stressed out, anxious, and kind of depressed young people. You see this rising in millennials. You also see suicide rising in the millennials when they're young. So, there's a lot of things going on. Like the Boomers, like Gen X, one of the things that's happening for millennials is in large part they start to check out of institutions, right? So millennials are, up to that point, the least likely to participate in things like religion, right? And if you've taken social religion with me in any way, shape, or form, you know that the millennials are where we get this big spike in what's called the nuns, right? Or, when you ask about their religious identity, they say nothing. None, nothing in particular, these sorts of things. So they're checking out of religion. They're also checking out of a lot of other social institutions, right? So politics. They're not super politically active. They don't take part in political parties in large numbers. They disengage from it. Social organizations, clubs, things like, the Lions Club, Kiwanis, any other kind of social activity that their parents used to take part in, the millennials are checking out of those as well. And increasingly, they are just these free agents bound to nothing which leads to increasing loneliness, right? And a lot of pressure to stand alone. And you see this, especially when they run into times of social crisis or of personal crisis. A lot of them, especially men, say that they have no one to turn to. And you start to see numbers in here, particularly for men, where they say that they have no friends, right? 0 friends. So a lot of social disconnection with the millennials. Okay. A rise of apathy, right? So along with their belief that anything can happen, you also get a sort of belief, or a declining belief in the efficacy of hard work and sacrifice. And one of the things that this manifests as is a sort of attitude of, let's say, wanting it all now, right? So even as they're coming into the workforce, and you start to see, around the beginning, like I guess around, let me think here, around 2002 to 2005 is when you get the first wave of the millennials really entering the job market. And one of the things that millennials seem to want is just everything right away without having to put in, out years, without having to sacrifice, your personal life when you're young. And you get the term coined by millennials, and it's all over HR speak of the time, work-life balance, right? Millennials want work-life balance. They don't want to repeat the overworked kind of lives that their boomer and Gen X parents lived. Okay. They have also kind of fading belief in civic action, right? So less belief in things like protest, a rise in cynicism, and a fall in a sense of personal responsibility, and especially civic engagement. It remains difficult, even as the oldest of the millennials now move into their 40s, to get millennials to vote. They don't vote in appreciable numbers, right? So lots of them do not vote, which has meant that the boomers and Gen X continue to wield disproportionate political power in lots of cases because they do show up to vote where the millennials and to some extent Gen Z doesn't. Okay. So kind of following the same trend as Gen X. So we talked about, right, Gen X becoming sexually active pretty early. Millennials became sexually active earlier than the boomers. And again, this gap between first sexual experience and the time they get married gets quite long. Exploring sexuality comes to be seen as a right and a freedom, something that is kind of inherent in the human condition. And we'll talk about this when we get to the kind of unit on sex and intimacy. Sexual behavior for the millennials really starts to become disconnected from emotional involvement. And there's a couple of things that kind of contribute to this. So one, of course, is porn. Pornography is widely available on the burgeoning internet. And it just kind of so happens that millennials are coming of age, right? They're turning into their late teens and going into emerging adulthood right around the same time as the internet is becoming commonly available, right? So a lot of adult content. The other thing that becomes increasingly common is what you would call hookup culture, right? Hookup culture, though it bleeds into the Gen Z as well, is really sort of brought in by millennials. And we'll talk about hookup culture when we get to sex and intimacy way later in the course, but we'll come back to it, and it's important. Okay. So the millennials also, kind of following this general trend we've seen, from the boomers onward, start to drop a lot of the prejudices, that were kind of in society before. And again, as they become disconnected from things like religion, a lot of these sort of older moral codes stop making sense to millennials. So what you get, is a lot of rethinking around gender, race, but especially, I think, sexual orientation, right? There's a real, it's probably the first generation where you have the widespread acceptance of LGBTQ people. It really starts with kind of gays and lesbians, The B, the T, and the Q, I think, follow a little bit later. But first is that acceptance of kind of gay and lesbian people. Millennials know a lot more people who are gays and lesbians. And it brings, a greater sense that this is a normal part of the human condition. Corresponding rise in tolerance and acceptance. And I think this one, I'm going to highlight this in another color for no apparent reason other than I want to, because I think it's important. For the millennials, it's seen as no big deal. Acceptance, of people regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation is just the right thing to do. It's not like you're being special or precious. It's just the right thing to do because they're just human beings, right? And that's the millennial view of it. Okay. Do you think increasing materialism is because of where the economy is, so people go to school to support their families, like they have no choice? No, I don't think that. There's just a shift in cultural values. Whether it's because you kind of have increasing affluence, so that becomes what the race of life is about, or because you have, how to put this? Okay, I'm going to tell you a little story. I'm going to try to be brief about it. You have a bunch of cultural movements, and especially sort of the postmodern ethos of the 1960s, like late 1960s into the 70s, and then through the 80s and 90s. You have the growth of this intellectual movement called postmodernism. And one of the big things about postmodernism, and how to define postmodernism really quickly, is it's a philosophical and social movement that has a tremendous suspicion of grand narratives, right? So any grand story that says it explains the whole world, postmodernism attacks, right? So religion, the Enlightenment, any of these, democracy, any of these big nationalism is a huge one that postmodernism attacks. All of these are undermined by the kind of slow bubbling of postmodernism starting in the academy, but it really by the time you hit the millennials, by the time they're in their teen years, postmodern thinking is deeply ingrained. They'll never probably, for the most part, read Foucault and Jacques Derrida, but they've absorbed the ideas of postmodernism deeply. Now, once you strip away grand narratives like why should you go to school? Well, it's to learn the Western civilization, right? Western civ courses are taken out of most colleges in the late 90s, for fear that they are colonialist, racist, all of that stuff. So if you're not attaching yourself to Western civilization, well, what do? Well, religious, do you attach yourself to a religion? That's fading too under the attack of secularism, postmodernism, and a bunch of other things, the sexual revolution. So there's not much left, right? And so I think people turn to a sort of self-focus, get what you get. What is the pirate thing from the Pirates of the Caribbean? Take what you can, give nothing back. That's the kind of ethos that you get with Gen X and millennials. And I think it's like, what else would you focus your life on? Because you're not focused on country or God anymore. You're focused on yourself. And yourself really likes stuff. To put it kind of bluntly. Would I say that millennials have a problem with bureaucracy since they want everything now? Man, I hate bureaucracy. So yeah, kind of. I think millennials have had a lot of problems with process, right? Millennials have had a lot of problems with the idea that you have to move through in steps, that you're not so magical, special, and wonderful, that you should just be given everything now, right? Like I joined Enterprise Rent-A-Car in 2006. Why wasn't I immediately made CEO of the company? I still don't know, right? No, I'm kidding. I hated that place. But that's, I think, definitely, the idea of working 65 hours a week at a rental car company rubbed me the wrong way. And yeah, I have maybe it's just me. I have a tremendous problem with authority, which makes me an okay academic, but an absolutely giant pain in the ass everywhere else, as my parents and anyone who's ever been in authority over me can tell you. Okay, does the millennial obsession with Disney have to do with their narcissism? No. We lived through the high period of Disney, what's called the Disney Renaissance, right? So this is the period starting with The Little Mermaid, going right up to about Hercules, in which Disney was just magic. And And so we lived through the good Disney. You all got the trash Disney. That's why you're like, Disney's dumb. But we, every year, honestly, I swear to God, every year when I was a kid, Disney launched a movie that was pure magic. And it was like, especially the first four, The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and then The Lion King. That was 4 straight absolute classics that Disney can now do nothing else other than ruin relentlessly. Also, at the time, Disney was re-releasing everything. Like, a lot of those films had been locked in the Disney vault for 25 years. And so they re-released everything from Snow White, Cinderella through most of their catalog. And so we got to live it again like it was brand new. And most of that stuff had been unavailable for a really long time. But it came out on glorious VHS cassette. And we watched it relentlessly. So that's why we're obsessed with Disney. Not me. I don't like Disney that much. But I remember it was like, you know, and I'm sorry, no matter what you do with Will Smith, he will never be as good a genie as Robin Williams. It just can't. No. Bad. Bad Disney. They've made things dark and horrible. Also, they ruined Star Wars. I'm just going to say it. So, yes, our obsession with Disney is, I think it's because we lived through the best of it and we got to relive the classics and some admitted failures from, you know, the 70s and 80s. But that's neither here nor there. Anyway, now that we've lost 10 minutes on that question. Okay, so, yes. Highlighter, wrong pen. I'm sorry I shrieked like that. That was probably loud in the microphone. All right, most millennials grew up with the internet as a pervasive part of their lives. So the earlier millennials, like me, remember when the internet wasn't a thing, right? But by 1995, everyone's talking about the internet. By 1998, so that's the year I started high school. By 1998, the internet is pretty pervasive, and most people who are middle class have access to it, and increasingly high-speed internet, right? So everybody, you know, kind of whose memories start a little bit later than 1998, you know, are going to live with the internet as just being there, right, and being a huge part of their lives. So this is why sometimes millennials are referred to as digital natives. This is a term that sometimes got thrown around with millennials, that they were digital natives, as opposed to the silence boomers and Gen X who were digital immigrants, right? Because they'd lived in a world without the internet. Okay, so they're the first ones. Well, a lot of their lives are online. You know, the first ones to have internet instant messaging on, you know, fabulous platforms like MSN Messenger and ICQ and all of these magical things. You know, the first to discover, you know, all of the wonders and horrors of the internet. No further explanations needed. Yeah, we're the ones who, by and large, are the first to experience social media. First with sites like MySpace. Yeah, MySpace. I actually never touched MySpace. I didn't even know it was a thing until it was compared to Facebook. But it was there. And then eventually Facebook. And Facebook becomes a major part of the landscape sort of around 2005, 2006. It starts to be kind of widely available, right? And people really start using it. I guess it becomes really big probably around 2008. Okay, so they are also pretty highly educated. In US, about 1 in 3 millennials have a 4-year college degree, right? In something, doesn't necessarily mean much, but it's 1 in 3 millennials have a 4-year college degree. The highest proportion of any generation up till that point. Okay. Economically, one of the things that people often suggest about millennials is, oh, they're the poor generation that's behind the 8 ball. You know, they lived through the 2008 recession, and so they'll never catch up. And Twenge thinks this is kind of hogwash. They're earning more in 2019 than the 3 previous generations did at the same point in their lives. Now, they started a little bit later because of all that university education. But because they have fewer kids, they have more disposable income. Okay, 34% less wealth than previous generations at the same age in 2016, but by 2019, it was only 11% less. So millennials are catching up really quickly. Now, a couple of things that are true here. Because of that extra education, right? Because of this 1 in 3 number, they start behind. And then that 2008 recession slows the economy right down and messes things up for millennials. But they make up for it really quickly, right? So they went to school for longer than the boomers and Xers, so they started later, right? They entered adulthood considerably later, often not until 27, 28 by the time they're really down to it. But today they've largely caught up in terms of incomes and wealth. Because they're more educated, their earning potential is a lot higher, right? And especially, very common to have, in married couples, to have both people having a college or university education, which means their earning potential is considerably higher than their parents, who often were working class, maybe had a trade, some of whom only finished high school, right? So the millennials, because they're so much more educated, they're much more upwardly mobile than their parents were. Okay. So, millennials are not actually poor. Millennials are doing okay. They do face a high cost of living, especially post-2022, right? Post-2022, the cost of... That was an unfortunate placement on my part. Post-2022, as you're writing, you're like, oopsie. High cost of living, especially in the US, though also in Canada, it takes them a while to pay off their college debt. But what Twenge suggests is one of the problems millennials have is sky-high expectations, right? They expected to have everything, right? Like they grew up with the boomers. The boomers are super affluent. They expect to live that same lifestyle really, really quickly, right? They don't have a great memory of what life was like when they were young, often where their boomer parents were struggling to pay the bills and all of that fun stuff. And so this creates a kind of weird disconnect between, objective indicators like wealth and income and the perception of millennials who are frankly constantly whining that life is harder for them than their parents, which, is a little bit nuts. Social media probably plays a role in this as well, and so does things like reality television. Okay, so social media, and here obviously is the story of social media as told by me about my wife's cousins. So my wife has a lot of cousins. I have a lot of cousins too. I just don't talk to them or follow them on social media for reasons that need not be borne out at this point. They're all hillbillies. That's enough. Alberta-based hillbillies, but hillbillies nonetheless. So, my wife's cousins. I always kind of find this funny because her one cousin, if I showed you her Facebook page or her Instagram, you would think this person lives the best life ever, right? All it is pictures of how wonderful her children are, her husband and all the gifts he gives her, their vacations, everything beautiful. Now, when you get down to brass tacks, and my wife and her cousin are really good friends, they talk all the time, her life is absolute bad. It's bad. Her kids have learning disabilities, there's struggle, there's medical issues, her marriage is halfway falling apart, right? There's so much stress and all of this stuff. But on social media, everything's hunky-dunky. That's right, I said hunky-dunky and I meant it. Social media and this kind of constant comparison culture, and I mean, when you tie in celebrities, it gets even worse because you're seeing the world through this distorted lens of everything's amazing, right? You're seeing all these beautiful people doing beautiful things. You go on YouTube and all you get, or TikTok, you get these influencers that are, jet setting around the world and everything's wonderful. And it makes, for weird social comparisons that you're falling behind. And this probably plays a role as well. I don't know why I keep pointing at the Kardashians, but I just want to more and more. It's all their fault. They're the worst. There we go. Okay, so how am I doing for time? Oh, 7 minutes. We can talk some more about the millennials. So if we want to talk about this slow life plan, right, going back to Twenge's whole thesis, the millennials have a very slow life plan. And what we can say is, maybe a short-ish, because they get into some things like sex pretty early, a short childhood, but a really long adolescence. Okay, so now when we talk about kind of, something like emerging adults and this idea of like a long adolescence, one of the things we're sort of looking at is those markers of what we used to think made an adult, right? So how do you know that someone has kind of transitioned out of adolescence or young adult, emerging adulthood into kind of adulthood proper? Well, there's usually a couple of things that we think of, right? So career is one, home ownership is another, and of course, marriage and kids, right? Family. So what do we see with the millennials? And why would we say that they have a pretty long kind of adolescence, or an adolescence that stretches into a long emerging adulthood? Okay, so amongst other things, they hit those markers really late, right? And marriage is probably, is way down the road. Average age at first marriage in the millennials, about 28 for women and 30 for men. So again, think about if we go back to our silence, right? The silence, it was what? Something like at its low point near 20 for women, and half of women who are getting married were teenagers. And for men, it was like somewhere between 23 and 26, right? So hitting those markers a lot sooner. Okay, quarter of millennial women had never been married by their late 30s, right? So 1 in 4. It was 1 in 18 for the boomers. And about 30% of men in their millennial men in their 30s never married, 15% for boomers, right? So it's doubled there. So big changes. Some experts think 1 in 5 or 20% of women will, in the millennial cohort, will never marry. Now, some of them obviously will cohabit and have children, but a lot of them won't. I don't want to say nasty things about her, but this is my sister. Constant disappointment to my parents. They worried she's going to die alone. I shrug at that. Get a cat. Okay, the percentage of I've said I don't get along with my sister. Percentage of 25 to 34-year-olds living with a partner has also declined, right? So a lot of people are just living alone. And, again, some people consider this a big problem, others don't. They're having fewer children than any generation in history. And what we're seeing is, generally declining fertility rates. Essentially the kind of fertile range now, again, and we talk fertile range, about 15 to 44, but obviously not that many people have children at the low end of the range. So the bulk of kind of people having children now are millennials, and you're talking about in Canada, something like 1.3 or between 1.3 and 1.6 children per woman. So well below replacement. And you had the age of a mother at the birth of her first child for mothers born in the early 90s, right, is 27. So that's the younger part of the millennial cohort. It's 27, right? So mothers are getting older. Now that in itself sort of leads to fewer births, right? Because the older you get married, the fewer years you have in that range of years where you can have children to have kids. So this is broadly slow life, right? That slow life plan that Twenge talks about, and individualism. And here We'll talk about this when we get to families, because I want to talk a little bit about marriage, because there's been some interesting research on it. But there's a definite shift in thinking about what marriage is. And people start to think of marriage as, I'll spoil my future lecture, but we'll come back to it, as a capstone, right? So instead of being at the foundation of your life, marriage is the thing that you do when you've got it all. So once you've done your traveling, you've done your sexual experimentation, you've got your career in order, you maybe own a property, maybe you have kids too already, then marriage is like the celebration of that, right? It's like the crown you put on top of your head. And this is a really fundamental shift that we see in kind of thinking about marriage. Okay, how am I? 2 minutes? I'll just, these charts, right? What do you see? Never married has gone pazoo, and married has gone ba-down, right? So married has gone down, never married has gone up. The percent of 25 to 39-year-olds who are married by generation, right? Again, downward trajectory, so way less marriage. And percent of 25 to 30-year-olds living with a certain arrangement. And you see, right, romantic partner is decreasing, and both alone or with roommates and living with your parents, everyone's dream, I'm sure, is increasing. Now, again, still more people live, with a romantic partner than not. That's still by far a majority position, but that majority is getting much smaller, right? You're now just clear of 50% living with a romantic partner. So it's declining, and it's declining relatively rapidly. If we compare to 1960 or 1965, sorry, it was about 80%, and it's just above a majority for the millennials. So that is definitely an interesting thing going on. 1 minute. We'll talk. Well, let's start here. This is a whole course in and of itself. We'll start here on Wednesday, and then we're gonna careen into more about the millennials. Lots more about the millennials. So much more. All right. Everything's gonna be about the millennials from here on in. All right. We'll see you on Wednesday. All right. Okay.